Hey, class, we are discussing Emily Dickinson, another 19th century author who lived during the 1800s, of course. And we read four, I think it's four. We read her poems were numbered, or identified by their first line, because Emily didn't really publish poems in her lifetime, and she mainly wrote them and stuffed them in her desk drawer. So we're reading her poem numbered 267, her poem numbered 455, her poem numbered 519, and her poem numbered 857. These are some of her really famous ones, so I hope you enjoy reading them. And Emily Dickinson, oh my gosh, I had said earlier we weren't reading any American poets. Emily, from this era, we are. Emily Dickinson, what was I thinking? She's an American poet. I forgot we were reading her this week. So yes, we do have an American here among the Brits. Yes, Emily Dickinson. Who could forget her? Ah, oh, what a poet. You're going to recognize some of these, I believe. You know, she has written some really famous poems that you may have heard, or whose lines you may have heard in referenced in other poems or works, you know, that borrowed some of her lines. Anyway, if you look at the written out lecture, we have a picture of Emily Dickinson here. So that's really neat. And we have, so you can see what she looks like, and not too many people saw what she looked like because she's kind of a hermit, you know. You'll hear about that in a minute. Anyway, we have websites that you can check out if you'd like more information about Emily. There's an overview of her life and works on online-literature.com in the lecture. There's also YouTube a clip that details the life and work of Emily Dickinson through many pictures of Emily's home and surroundings. If you want to see where she lived with, got that to check out. There's a YouTube clip that documents a lecture, or it is a lecture on, on Emily's poetry and life. And there's another website that you can check out with links about her poetry and life. Alrighty, so Emily Dickinson lived from 1830 till 1886, till 55 years of age. So again, lived to about the same time as, say, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and also, let's see, also Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin Shelley lived to about the same ages, you know, so didn't die tragically young, but also didn't live, you know, into old age, shall we say, is what we would consider nowadays, right, as a long life. So her doctor diagnosed the cause of her death as a kidney infection, then known as Bright's disease. Emily was the middle child of three in a well-to-do family in Amherst, Massachusetts. So, as I said, she grew up in the United States. She's an American and was born here. She apparently had a meek mother and a lawyer father. She attended the Amherst Academy for 7 years and Mount Holyoke Female Seminary. So the Amherst Academy was for women, of course, and the Mount Holyoke Female Seminary for 1 year. After that, you know, so first she was able to get an education, so that was great. And she went away from home, too, to do it. So that was also huge when you think of how she lived her later life. After that, she retired to her home in Amherst and gradually sank into the reclusivity that marked the rest of her life. But that also permitted her to write almost 2,000 poems, as well as volumes of letters to family and friends. So here you go. She was in her room of her own. She did not have to work to support herself, and she had a private sphere in which to focus and work and write and rewrite. And so she was extremely productive, even though she was secluded and what we would call probably a hermit, and maybe wonder if she had like some mental illness or something, because she, you know, just stayed in that room. Kind of like we saw Elizabeth Barrett, you know, secluding herself after all those deaths she had suffered in her life, of her brothers and her mother, you know, where she kind of secluded herself in her sick room. And it took Robert Browning, to kind of pull her out of that. And they eloped, and she led a very different life after that. Well, Emily Dickinson actually stayed in her room. Emily's sister, Lavinia, discovered Emily's poems after Emily died. Yeah. So here she wrote, so she was 55 years of age, wrote, 2,000 poems and all these letters to families and friends. And her sister discovered most of them after Emily had died. Many of them had been sewn neatly into books stored in Emily's bedroom drawers. During Emily's lifetime, only 8 of her poems had been published, and they were heavily edited by others. So the ones that were published got heavily edited. So not true representations of her poetry. In 1955, an unedited version of her poems was finally published. Much of the previous editing that had been performed ameliorated Emily's strange spellings, short lines, unconventional punctuation, and even morose subject matter. So yeah, she was heavily edited for her spelling, or short lines, for strange punctuation, and morose, or sad, dark subject matter. All right, so finally in 1955, though, an unedited version was published, and we finally got to see her actual writings, what she wrote and how she intended them to be. All right. The myth, she was called the myth of Amherst, because Emily was known because of her total seclusion and customary dress in total white. So yeah, it was, like rumored about, like, oh, there's this, woman, Emily Dickinson. She dresses all in white. She lives all alone. She lives, she keeps herself secluded from the rest of society. How strange. She became, the talk of rumors. She wrote poems in addition to like living completely unconventionally that way. She also wrote poems that were wholly unconventional for the time period. As mentioned above, the poem's spellings and punctuation are strange. Her poems often uses dashes. Like, we don't usually see a lot of dashes till more modern typewriting. Yet she used them a lot. And she's run-on lines, and she didn't capitalize a lot of words. The rhyme of the poem is often only near or slant, which means it's not like a perfect rhyme, what we consider a classic rhyme, like where you have the same sound of a word, and then you just change like the consonant or the vowel sound that begins the word. So most of her poems had near rhymes or slant rhymes. So that means that they were like kind of close, but not what we would call a perfect rhyme. So again, that's also unconventional for the time period. And the rhythm is highly varied from short to longer lines with unusual stress patterns. Emily's word choice and subject matter equally suit her poem's unconventional style and form. Her poems often deal with life and death, seclusion and the world, the body and the spiritual, personal identity versus societal roles, and the occupation of poet. These were themes that are evidenced in the poems of hers that we read this week. Number 267, which was written in 1861. Number 455, written in 1862. Number 519, written in 1863. And number 857, written in 1864. Interestingly, these, if you notice by those dates, they were all written during the Civil War too. So a lot was going on in that country, in America at that time when she was writing and squirreling away her poems. Many have speculated that the cause of Emily's seclusion, well, they speculated about what it was, first of all. Some read her letters and extrapolate from those letters that she had a disappointed love affair, and that the trauma resulted in her utter withdrawal from the world. Her letters during the early 1860s, from which, we read these poems, like during that time period of the Civil War when she's writing these poems, they often address a mysterious master. Yeah, that's in her letters. And they're often tortured, but sometimes even erotic, which is interesting considering she just sequestered herself alone in a room. All day. I mean, she wouldn't even let like doctors examine her. Like she'd maybe like put out an arm or something or a leg. And it was all dressed in her white. Many theorize that the most likely candidate for such a love affair would have been the married but charismatic Reverend Charles Wadsworth, whom she met in 1855. but not that she would have had an actual relationship with, but like, maybe kind of like uh, a love affair from afar. That she loved him, but not that it was necessarily reciprocated. Others speculate that Emily's mysterious beloved behind the letters is her dear sister-in-law, Susan Gilbert Dickinson. Still others theorize that the object of Emily's affections is actually her own literary art itself. So maybe it was a metaphor for writing. She was in love with writing and poetry. So we don't know. But that is Emily and her world, and enjoy the poems that we read of hers this week. She's an intriguing figure indeed.